Before we begin, I want you to close your eyes for a moment. Not yet. Not quite. First, I want you to picture something. Picture the most powerful city in the ancient world. A city that sits where the Nile pours itself into the Mediterranean Sea. A city of white marble and golden lamplight, of libraries larger than anything ever built before or since, of harbours crowded with ships from every civilization on Earth. A city so wealthy, so impossibly magnificent, that when foreign kings visited for the first time, they wept. Not from sadness, from pure, overwhelming awe. This is Alexandria, Egypt, and the year is somewhere around 51 BCE. And in the royal palace, a palace so sprawling it occupied an entire district of the city, there is a young woman sitting in a room full of scrolls. She is 21 years old. She is slender, dark-eyed, sharp as a blade in a world that has been trying to break her since the moment she was born. She speaks 9 languages, perhaps more. She is the only ruler of her entire dynasty, a dynasty that has ruled Egypt for nearly 300 years. Who has ever bothered to learn the language of the Egyptian people she governs? She is a mathematician, a philosopher, a naval commander, a politician so gifted that she would bend the mightiest empire the world had ever seen, the Roman Republic, not once, but twice, to her will. And she is about to do something so audacious, so reckless, so magnificently calculated, that people will be talking about it 2,000 years from now. Her name is Cleopatra, the 7th Philopator, and this is her entire story. Settle in, get comfortable, pull your blanket a little closer, because tonight we are going to travel back 2,000 years to a world of papyrus and perfume, of palace intrigue and civil war, of love affairs that shook empires, and a woman who refused, absolutely refused, to be forgotten. This is one of the greatest stories ever lived, and it belongs entirely to her. To understand Cleopatra, you first have to understand the world she was born into. Not just Egypt, not just Rome, but the entire trembling, magnificent, collapsing architecture of the ancient Mediterranean world in its final gorgeous hours before everything changed forever. Let us go back further. Let us go all the way back. In 332 BCE, more than 300 years before Cleopatra drew her first breath, a young Macedonian general marched into Egypt with an army behind him that seemed to materialize out of the desert wind itself. His name was Alexander. You may have heard of him. He was 23 years old, golden-haired, burning with a kind of ambition that the ancient world had never quite seen before. He had already conquered Persia. He had smashed the most powerful empire in the world at the time. He was now turning his gaze south and west toward the oldest civilization on Earth. Egypt did not resist him. Egypt welcomed him. Egypt. The Persian rulers who had controlled Egypt before Alexander were despised. They had desecrated Egyptian temples. They had mocked Egyptian gods. They had ruled with the cold arrogance of conquerors who never intended to stay. Alexander was different, or at least he understood the value of appearing different. He travelled to the ancient oracle at the Siwa oasis, deep in the western desert, a journey of treacherous sand and burning silence. And there, the priests of the god Amun declared him divine, the son of a god, Pharaoh. Alexander accepted this with the ease of a man who had always half believed it. He walked the banks of the Nile Delta and pointed to a stretch of coastline and said, "Here is where I will build my city. Here is where the world will come to me." And so, Alexandria was born. Alexander laid out the plans personally, the grid of streets, the harbour, the future location of the great lighthouse that would one day be one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. He was so certain of this city's destiny that he reportedly marked out the boundaries using grain because he had no chalk. The birds ate the grain. His seers said this was a bad omen. Alexander said no. It means the city will feed the world. He was right. But Alexander did not stay to watch his city rise. He turned east again, always east, deeper into Asia, chasing the horizon of his own impossible ambitions. He died in Babylon in 323 BCE, just 32 years old, possibly from typhoid, possibly from poisoning, possibly, as some have whispered across the centuries, simply from the effort of trying to be Alexander. He left behind an empire with no clear heir and no plan. His generals divided the world among themselves, like hungry men splitting a loaf of bread. Egypt went to a man named Ptolemy, and everything, absolutely everything, that follows begins here. Ptolemy was canny in a way that Alexander, for all his genius, was. Alexander conquered through speed and brilliance and what seemed like divine favour. Ptolemy conquered through patience. Ptolemy understood that Egypt was not just a country, it was a concept, a civilization so ancient that compared to it, even Greece and Rome were children still learning to walk. The pyramids at Giza were already 2,000 years old when Ptolemy arrived. The temples of Karnak and Luxor were older than most nations in the world. You did not simply rule Egypt with a sword, you had to become Egypt. And so Ptolemy began a transformation. He adopted Egyptian customs, selectively, strategically. He honored Egyptian gods alongside Greek ones. He presented himself in the dual role of Greek king and Egyptian pharaoh. He built temples in the traditional Egyptian style and had himself carved into them in the stiff, formal posture of a pharaoh, hieroglyphs proclaiming his divine nature. He was brilliant. He was calculating. He was, in many ways, a prototype for the ruler who would come 3 centuries later and perfect everything he started. He built the great library of Alexandria, a monument so extraordinary that we still mourn its eventual loss. At its height, the library contained somewhere between 400,000 and 700,000 scrolls. Every ship that entered the harbour of Alexandria was searched, and any books found were taken and copied. The ship got the copy. The library kept the original. They were assembling the entire knowledge of the known world under one roof: geography, mathematics, astronomy, medicine, poetry, philosophy, history, drama. The great minds of the ancient world were invited to Alexandria, funded by the royal treasury, given rooms in the palace complex, and set loose to think. Euclid developed his geometry here. Eratosthenes calculated the circumference of the earth here with remarkable accuracy, more than 1,700 years before Columbus would set sail believing the world was flat. The physician Herophilos conducted the first systematic study of human anatomy here, laying the groundwork for everything that would come after in medicine. This was the intellectual capital of the ancient world, and it was built by Cleopatra's ancestors. The Ptolemaic dynasty ruled Egypt for nearly 300 years. Ptolemy I, then Ptolemy II, then Ptolemy III, and so on, like a long chain of golden links stretching across the generations. They kept their bloodline pure, or tried to, through a practice that is deeply unsettling by modern standards, but was common in royal dynasties of the ancient world. They married each other. Siblings married siblings. Uncles married nieces. Cousins married cousins. The logic was simple and brutal. Power must not leave the family. Wealth must not be divided. The divine bloodline must not be diluted. The result, over 3 centuries, was a dynasty of increasingly complicated personalities. Some Ptolemies were brilliant, some were drunk, some were murderous, some were all 3 simultaneously. By the time we reach the final century of Ptolemaic rule, the dynasty is in serious, possibly terminal decline. Egypt is still fabulously wealthy. Alexandria is still the greatest city in the world, or at least in the top two, the other contender being Rome, which is growing at a terrifying speed and casting hungry eyes in every direction. But the Ptolemaic rulers themselves have become soft, paranoid, and politically inept. They are losing their grip. And Rome is watching. Rome is always watching. By the 1st century BCE, Rome is not yet an empire. It is still technically a republic, governed by a senate of powerful aristocrats who make decisions collectively. But this republic is fraying at the seams. Military commanders are growing more powerful than the Senate itself. Men like Sulla, like Pompey, like Julius Caesar are accumulating personal armies and personal wealth and personal ambitions that the old structures of republican governance cannot contain. Rome is eating itself from the inside. And in the middle of all this vast, trembling, magnificent chaos of the late Roman Republic, is the Egypt of the Ptolemies. Egypt is important to Rome, critically, existentially important. Egypt produces grain, more grain than almost anywhere else in the ancient world. The Nile floods every year with mathematical precision, depositing rich silt across the fields, ensuring harvests that Roman farmers could only dream of. Egypt feeds the Roman world. Rome knows this. Rome has always known this. And in the last decades before Cleopatra's birth, Rome begins to make its move. Roman politicians begin interfering in Egyptian succession crises. Roman creditors begin lending enormous sums of money to desperate Ptolemaic rulers who need cash to bribe the Roman Senate into leaving them alone. It is a cycle of dependency, manipulation, and slow strangulation. Egypt is slowly being digested by Rome. And into this world, this extraordinary, dangerous, magnificent, collapsing world, Cleopatra VII is born, somewhere around 69 BCE, in the most dazzling city on earth, the daughter of a desperate king, and the future of everything. Close your eyes now, if you haven't already. Let the story carry you. Picture a child walking through corridors of white marble, her small footsteps echoing in halls so tall the ceiling seems to touch the sky. The air smells of lotus flowers and frankincense. Through the tall windows, the Mediterranean sparkles like scattered diamonds. Somewhere below, in the harbour, 100 ships rock gently in the blue water. This is Cleopatra's childhood. Beautiful. And underneath the beauty, terrifying. Her father was Ptolemy XII, a man known by the somewhat unflattering nickname Orleats, which means the flute player. This was not a compliment. His contemporaries used it to suggest he was frivolous, easily distracted, more interested in music and pleasure than in the serious business of ruling an empire. This was perhaps unfair. Ptolemy XII was not stupid, but he was weak in precisely the ways that the era demanded strength. He faced an impossible situation. Rome was circling. The Egyptian treasury was nearly empty from decades of mismanagement. His own people increasingly despised him, and he had to perform the impossible balancing act of keeping Rome satisfied while keeping his own population from revolt. He failed at it repeatedly. In 58 BCE, when Cleopatra was about 11 years old, Rome annexed the neighbouring island of Cyprus, which had been part of the Ptolemaic kingdom. Ptolemy's brother, who ruled Cyprus, killed himself rather than surrender. Ptolemy XII did nothing. He could do nothing. He lacked the military power to resist Rome. But his inaction was seen as cowardice and betrayal. Riots broke out in Alexandria. The Alexandrian mob, one of the most volatile and dangerous political forces in the ancient world, turned against him. Ptolemy XII fled to Rome. He literally ran away. He left his children behind in the palace, including his eldest daughter Berenice, who promptly declared herself queen, and little Cleopatra, who was perhaps 11 or 12 years old and now lived in a royal palace controlled by the sister who had just stolen their father's throne. Think about what that means for a child. Your father is gone. Your sister has taken power. The political situation is violent and unstable, and you are living in a court where betrayal and murder are not unusual tools of governance. Cleopatra learned the real curriculum of palace life early. She learned to watch, to listen, to say very little and absorb everything, to read a room the way a sailor reads weather, to understand that in this world, information was power, loyalty was negotiable, and the only person you could truly trust was yourself. She also learned languages. This is one of the most remarkable things about Cleopatra, and one of the most frequently overlooked. The Ptolemaic dynasty had ruled Egypt for nearly 300 years by the time Cleopatra was born. And in all that time, not one of her ancestors, not one, had learned to speak Egyptian. They conducted all royal business in Greek. Greek was the language of the court, of the library, of commerce and administration. Egyptian was the language of the people, of the farmers and priests and craftsmen, who actually made the country function. But to the Ptolemies, Egyptian was beneath them. Cleopatra thought differently. She began studying languages with the intensity that some children devote to music or sport. She learned Egyptian. Then she learned Aramaic, the common tongue of the Near East. Then Ethiopian. Then the languages of the Parthians, the Medes, the Arabs. She reportedly also spoke Hebrew and could converse with Jewish envoys in their own tongue, a gesture of respect that carried enormous political weight. By the time she was a teenager, she was fluent in perhaps 9 languages. But more than the languages themselves, she understood what languages meant. They meant connection. They meant respect. They meant that when a foreign dignitary came to the Egyptian court, instead of speaking through an interpreter, which always created distance, always allowed for misunderstanding, always reminded both parties that they were fundamentally different, Cleopatra could simply turn to them and speak directly, in their own words, with their own sounds. The effect was reportedly electric. People who met her described the experience of talking to Cleopatra as intoxicating, not because she was conventionally beautiful. Ancient sources are somewhat divided on this question, but because she was completely, utterly present. Her voice, her attention, the sense that she was the most intelligent person in the room and was genuinely, specifically interested in you. This was not charm in the shallow sense. This was mastery. This was a woman who had studied human beings the way a general studies terrain. Meanwhile, in Rome, her father was doing what Ptolemy XII did best, spending money and making promises. He borrowed enormous sums from Roman financiers, particularly a man named Rabirius Postumus, and later the triumvir Marcus Crassus, to fund his lobbying of the Roman Senate. He needed Rome to declare him legitimate, to restore him to his throne, to send Roman troops to Alexandria to put down the rebellion and reinstate him as king. This cost an almost incomprehensible amount of money. The debt that Ptolemy XII accumulated to reclaim his throne would haunt Egypt and Cleopatra for decades to come. In 55 BCE, Roman troops marched into Alexandria. Berenice IV, who had been ruling in her father's absence, was captured. Ptolemy XII had his eldest daughter executed. He returned to his throne over her corpse. This is the world Cleopatra was growing up in. Her father, the king, had just had her sister killed. She was perhaps 14 years old. She learned the lesson. Power was not given. It was seized. And once seized, it was kept through a ruthlessness that the comfortable world of scrolls and philosophy could barely imagine. In the years that followed his restoration, Ptolemy XII ruled a kingdom that was essentially a Roman client state. He owed so much money to Roman creditors that the Egyptian treasury was being systematically looted to pay the interest on debts that could never truly be repaid. He was a sick man too, physically declining, growing weaker each year. And so, as was the Ptolemaic custom, he began training his heir. Cleopatra was his favourite, his most capable child by far. He brought her into his councils. He let her sit in on diplomatic meetings. He began treating her less as a daughter and more as an apprentice. She absorbed everything. By the time Ptolemy XII died, in 51 BCE, when Cleopatra was approximately 18 years old, she was as prepared as a person could be for the impossible job that lay ahead. In his will, Ptolemy XII named 2 heirs to rule jointly, his daughter Cleopatra VII and his 10-year-old son Ptolemy XIII. Per Ptolemaic custom, they would marry each other. The Queen of Egypt was 18 years old. Her husband and co-ruler was a decade younger, and the vultures, political, military and Roman, were already beginning to circle. To be Queen of Egypt at 18 in 51 BCE was to be handed a ship in the middle of a storm and told not just to survive, but to steer. The ship was magnificent. No one disputed that. Egypt's wealth, even after decades of Ptolemaic mismanagement, was still staggering by ancient standards. The grain of the Nile Delta, the papyrus marshes, the quarries of rose granite and alabaster, the trade routes that ran from the Mediterranean to sub-Saharan Africa, from the Red Sea to the Persian Gulf. But the debt was crushing, and the political situation inside the palace was already deteriorating. Cleopatra was sharp enough to recognize immediately that the greatest danger was not Rome, not yet. The greatest immediate danger was the faction inside her own court that surrounded her young brother-husband. Ptolemy XIII was 10 years old, which meant that in practical terms, real power was held by his advisors. And his advisors were 3 of the most dangerous men in the court. There was Pothinus, the chief minister, a eunuch of extraordinary political cunning, who understood that a child king was far easier to manipulate than a brilliant adult queen. He resented Cleopatra deeply because Cleopatra could not be managed. There was Achilles, commander of the Egyptian military, a professional soldier whose loyalties ran to whoever was paying him and whoever could protect his power. And there was Theodotus, Ptolemy XIII's tutor, a rhetorician from Chios who was clever with words, in the way that a scorpion is clever with its tail. These 3 men would become the defining antagonists of the first chapter of Cleopatra's reign. They opposed her at every turn. She tried to rule as a single monarch, issuing decrees in her own name, appearing on coins without her brother's image. This was a provocation by Ptolemaic standards. The tradition was joint rule, even if one ruler was clearly dominant. But Cleopatra had no patience for the fiction of shared power when she was the one doing all the governing. Within 2 years of taking the throne, the situation had deteriorated beyond rescue. There were famines in Upper Egypt, caused by an unusually low Nile flood, a bad omen that the priests interpreted as divine displeasure. The treasury was under constant pressure, and the faction around Ptolemy XIII was actively working to undermine Cleopatra at every opportunity. Around 49 BCE, something happened that forced the issue. Cleopatra was pushed off the throne. The details are murky, as they tend to be with palace coups that the winners later try to legitimize. But the essential fact is this. Ptolemy XIII's faction succeeded in having Cleopatra removed from power and forced into exile. She fled to the eastern frontier of Egypt, near the border with Judea and Syria. She was perhaps 20 years old. She had lost her kingdom. She was alone in the desert, and she had absolutely no intention of staying that way. This is where Cleopatra's real education begins. Not in the palace, not in the libraries, not in the diplomatic salons of Alexandria, in the desert, in exile, in the crucible of absolute necessity. She began raising an army. This was not a simple thing. She had to find soldiers willing to fight for a deposed queen against the established king of Egypt, which meant fighting against the formal Egyptian military. She had to find money to pay them. She had to convince tribal leaders along the eastern frontier that her restoration was both possible and worth their investment. She was negotiating with mercenary commanders, with Arab sheikhs, with Jewish leaders in the border regions, deploying that astonishing gift for languages and personal connection at every opportunity. She was doing all of this while receiving intelligence from inside Alexandria about the political situation there and the movements of her brother's army. Meanwhile, in Rome, the world was exploding. The great civil war between Julius Caesar and Pompey the Great had finally erupted. The Roman Republic, which had been slowly tearing itself apart for decades, was now consuming itself with spectacular violence. Caesar had crossed the Rubicon in January of 49 BCE, an act of military defiance against the Senate that was tantamount to declaring war on the Roman state itself. And now, Caesar and Pompey were locked in a struggle for control of the entire Roman world. In June of 48 BCE, Caesar won a decisive battle in Greece, and Pompey fled. Pompey needed a safe harbor. He needed allies. He turned toward Egypt. He had history with Egypt. Years earlier, as one of Rome's great commanders, he had been a patron of Ptolemy XII. He had helped the old king in various ways during the period of restoration. Pompey believed the young king Ptolemy XIII would grant him sanctuary. He sailed toward Alexandria. On the shore, Ptolemy XIII's advisors debated what to do. Pothinus, Achilles, and Theodotus huddled together and considered the mathematics. On one side, Julius Caesar, who was pursuing Pompey and had just won the most decisive military engagement of the Civil War. Caesar was clearly the ascendant power. On the other side, Pompey, who had just lost. The logic was as cold as the blade they were about to use. On September 28th, 48 BCE, as Pompey's small boat approached the Egyptian shore near the city of Pelusium, he was greeted with apparent welcome. He was invited to step into a small rowing boat to be escorted ashore. He was murdered in the boat, stabbed from behind, by his own former soldiers, who had been suborned by Pothinus and Achilles. His head was cut off, his signet ring was taken, and Pothinus believed he had done something brilliant. He believed he had secured Egypt's future by eliminating the losing side of the Roman civil war before it could drag Egypt down with it. He was wrong. He had just made the single worst political calculation of the era, because Julius Caesar arrived 3 days later, and when he learned what had happened to Pompey, when the severed head of his great rival was presented to him as a gift, Caesar wept. Not from grief for Pompey exactly. Their relationship was complex. Caesar had defeated him. But Pompey had been his son-in-law. Pompey had been a Roman, a general, a man of dignity, and he had been murdered like a dog. Caesar was furious. He was also, crucially, now in Alexandria, with Roman troops, and Cleopatra's faction and Ptolemy's faction were both doing everything they could to secure his allegiance. The most consequential game of chess in ancient history was about to begin. Caesar had arrived in Alexandria with approximately 4,000 soldiers, enough to make his presence felt, not enough to impose his will by force. He intended this as a diplomatic visit. He would settle the dispute between the two Egyptian co-rulers collect the enormous debts owed to Rome from the late Ptolemy XII, and move on. This was the plan. Ptolemy XIII's advisors understood this perfectly, and they understood something else. If Caesar decided to throw his support behind Cleopatra, she would be restored to the throne with the backing of the most powerful military commander in the world. They could not allow Cleopatra to reach Caesar. They posted guards. They watched the harbours. They maintained effective control of the city. They were confident that if they could keep Cleopatra away from Caesar long enough, Caesar would have to deal with them instead of her, and they would present such a convincing case for Ptolemy XIII's legitimacy that Cleopatra would never recover. Cleopatra knew all of this. She also knew that she had one advantage that her brother's handlers could not neutralize: herself. What she did next was so bold, so perfectly calculated, so theatrically magnificent that it has been told and retold for 2,000 years. She had herself smuggled into the royal palace inside a rolled carpet, or perhaps a large sack. The ancient sources differ slightly on this detail, but the essential fact remains: Cleopatra was carried through the streets of Alexandria, through the gates of the palace, past the guards of her brother's court, concealed in fabric. She arrived in Caesar's private chambers, and when the carpet was unrolled, or the sack was opened, there she was, 21 years old, the Queen of Egypt, standing before the most powerful man in the Western world, having just performed one of the most audacious acts of personal diplomacy ever recorded. Caesar was 52 years old. He had met kings. He had conquered tribes. He had negotiated with the most dangerous men in the world. He had never met anyone quite like this. Now, what happened next has been romanticized, sensationalized, and mythologized to an almost absurd degree by 2,000 years of storytelling. So let us be clear about what we actually know and what we can reasonably infer. We know they talked. For a long time. Through the night, most likely. Caesar was brilliant in the way that genuinely great military and political minds are brilliant. He could see angles that other people missed. He could construct strategies in real time. He could hold enormous complexity in his mind without losing the thread. And Cleopatra, in that long conversation, showed him everything. Not herself exactly, not in the superficial sense, but her mind, her strategic thinking, her understanding of the Egyptian political situation, of the dynamics of the court, of the challenges Rome faced in maintaining its interests in the East. She made the case for herself not just as a woman or even as a queen. She made the case for herself as an ally, a genuinely useful one. Caesar had come to Alexandria thinking of Egypt primarily as a source of grain and debt repayment. After that night, he began thinking about Egypt differently, about what it could be under a ruler who was both brilliant and favorable to Rome. The next morning, Caesar summoned both Cleopatra and Ptolemy XIII to appear before him. Ptolemy XIII, guided by Pothinus and Achilles, walked into what he thought was a diplomatic meeting and discovered that Caesar had already made his decision. The boy king reportedly threw his crown on the floor in fury. He was 10 years old. That is worth remembering. He was a 10-year-old child, surrounded by manipulative adults who were using him as a puppet. But in that moment, his tantrum played directly into the narrative that Cleopatra had been building in her conversation with Caesar. The chaos and immaturity of the Ptolemaic court under the control of Pothinus and Achilles versus the steady, capable, diplomatic intelligence of Cleopatra. Caesar declared that he would arbitrate the dispute. He declared that both Cleopatra and Ptolemy XIII should rule jointly, as their father's will had intended. He was, of course, buying time, and perhaps he was genuinely trying to find a workable solution. But by this point, Cleopatra was at Caesar's side. and the entire balance of power in Alexandria had shifted overnight. Pothinus and Achilles were not going to accept this quietly. What followed was one of the most dramatic military episodes of the ancient world. Achilles marched the Egyptian army, tens of thousands of soldiers, toward Alexandria, toward the palace, toward Caesar and Cleopatra. This was an act of open war against Rome. Caesar was trapped in the palace district with a small force, a hostile city around him, and the Egyptian navy in the harbour capable of cutting off any reinforcements. He did something characteristically Caesar. He went on offence. He ordered the burning of the Egyptian fleet in the harbour. The fire, driven by harbour winds, spread to the docklands, and from there, according to some ancient sources, to a portion of the great library of Alexandria, one of the most haunting and debated moments in ancient history. The extent of the damage has been argued by scholars for centuries. Some sources suggest only the storage warehouses near the docks were affected, not the library itself. Others suggest the damage was more extensive. Either way, Alexandria was burning, and inside the palace, Caesar and Cleopatra were effectively under siege. This period, the Alexandrian War, lasted for months. Through the autumn of 48 BCE and into the spring of 47 BCE, the fighting raged through the streets of Alexandria, in the harbour, on the islands and causeways that defined the city's complex waterfront geography. Caesar was cut off. He was in the most dangerous position of his military career. He was fighting a major urban battle far from his main forces with a small contingent of troops, relying on his tactical genius and the extraordinary loyalty of the soldiers who fought with him. During this period, Cleopatra was never far from the centre of events. She is not described as a passive observer hiding in the palace. She was in council with Caesar. She was communicating with her own supporters outside the city. She was managing the political dimensions of a crisis that was simultaneously military, diplomatic, and personal. And yes, in the midst of all this chaos, war, and danger, Cleopatra and Caesar were conducting what appears to have been a genuine love affair. She became pregnant. Pothinus was executed during this period. Caesar had him killed when he discovered Pothinus was sending secret messages to Achilles, coordinating the military pressure on the palace from inside. Achilles was subsequently killed by one of his own officers, a woman named Arsinoe, Cleopatra's younger sister, who had escaped from the palace, joined the besieging army, and was maneuvering to position herself as an alternative queen. Arsinoe's relationship with Cleopatra was about as warm as you would expect between sisters in a dynasty where siblings routinely killed each other for power. In the spring of 47 BCE, Roman reinforcements finally arrived. A combined force, including legions from Syria and soldiers contributed by Mithridates of Pergamon. Caesar broke out of the palace district and fought a decisive battle near the Nile Delta. Ptolemy XIII, the boy king, Cleopatra's brother-husband, fled from the battle and tried to cross the Nile in a boat. The boat was overloaded. It sank. Ptolemy XIII drowned. He was 13 years old. And just like that, the war was over. Caesar had won. Cleopatra had won. She was now, effectively, the sole ruler of Egypt. In the spring of 47 BCE, with the civil war resolved and her enemies dead or captured, Cleopatra sailed up the Nile. She sailed with Julius Caesar. This journey, what the ancient sources call the Thalamigos, the Great State Barge Voyage, was one of the most extraordinary events of the ancient world, and yet it receives relatively little attention in most historical accounts, perhaps because it sits awkwardly between the categories of history and romance. The royal barge was enormous. Ancient descriptions suggest it was approximately 300 feet long, multiple stories tall, built of cedar and cypress wood, decorated with marble floors, gilded columns, painted ceilings, hanging gardens on the upper decks. It was, essentially, a floating palace. And Cleopatra and Caesar sailed up the Nile for weeks, possibly months, visiting the ancient temples and monuments of Egypt, the colossal statues at Memphis, the great sphinxes, the tombs of the pharaohs. What was the purpose of this voyage? Part of it was certainly pleasure. After months of siege and civil war, the release of tension must have been almost physical. But part of it, probably the larger part for Cleopatra, was political theatre. She was showing Caesar her kingdom. She was showing him what Egypt meant, what it represented, what it was capable of. She was, in a sense, educating the most powerful man in the Western world about why Egypt was worth protecting, why she was worth protecting. And she was showing Egypt its queen. Cleopatra had been at war, in exile, or under siege for nearly 2 years. Now she moved through her kingdom in state, seated alongside the greatest military commander of the age, as visibly powerful and secure as any pharaoh in history. The priests of the great temples would have come out to greet them. The farmers along the banks would have watched the great barge pass. Cleopatra the pharaoh, Cleopatra the goddess, Cleopatra who had reclaimed her throne from enemies within and without, and was now sailing her own river in the company of the man who ruled the world. It was a masterpiece of political communication. In June of 47 BCE, Cleopatra gave birth to a son. She named him Ptolemy Philopator Philometor Caesar, but everyone called him Caesarion, Caesar's son. Caesar never formally acknowledged the child as his own. This was politically complicated. He had a wife in Rome, and the Roman world had complicated feelings about relationships between Roman men and foreign queens. But he did not deny it either, and the name Caesarion, Little Caesar, makes his position clear enough. The birth of Caesarion was enormously significant. For Cleopatra, her son was the ultimate guarantee of Egypt's future. He was the union of the Ptolemaic dynasty and the most powerful family in Rome. He was Egyptian royalty and Roman power made flesh. He was the bridge between two worlds. She would spend the rest of her life trying to keep him safe and ensure his future. Caesar returned to Rome. He had to. The civil wars were not finished. Pompey's sons were still fighting in Africa and Spain. The Roman world was still in chaos. Caesar's place was in Rome, not on a pleasure barge in Egypt. He left Egypt in July of 47 BCE, taking with him the Egyptian prisoner Arsinoe, Cleopatra's sister, to march in his triumph in Rome. He left behind 3 legions to protect Cleopatra and ensure Egypt's stability. He left behind, perhaps, something more personal. The ancient sources are maddeningly vague about the emotional dimensions of the relationship between Caesar and Cleopatra. They tell us what happened, but not what was felt. They describe the political alliance, but barely hint at the personal one. What can we say? We can say that Caesar was a man who throughout his life was drawn to extraordinary people, people of unusual intelligence, unusual daring, unusual capability. He married and divorced strategically, but was capable of deep admiration for human excellence. Cleopatra was by any measure extraordinary. We can say that Cleopatra was not naive. She understood perfectly well that Caesar was useful to her in the most practical possible sense. He was the guarantor of her throne, the protector of her kingdom, the father of her son. She would have been a fool to let sentiment interfere with that calculation. She was not a fool. but the ancient world's image of Cleopatra as a calculating seductress who deployed her body as a political weapon. This is a Roman characterization, written by Roman men who were deeply uncomfortable with a woman who exercised power on her own terms. It should be treated with significant skepticism. The truth is probably more nuanced. A genuine connection, complicated by enormous power differentials and enormous political stakes, between two of the most remarkable minds of the ancient world. In 46 BCE, Caesar invited Cleopatra to Rome. She came. She brought Caesarion. She brought a magnificent entourage. She installed herself in Caesar's own villa on the other side of the Tiber River. Rome was scandalized. Not because Caesar had a foreign lover. This was not particularly unusual for powerful Roman men. But because Cleopatra was not just a foreign lover. She was a reigning queen, in possession of her own throne, and her own power, and her own agenda. She was not a dependent. She was a peer. And powerful Roman women, the wives and sisters of senators, the matrons of old Roman families, found this deeply threatening. Cicero, the great orator and politician, wrote about meeting Cleopatra during this period. He despised her. He described her as arrogant and insufferable. He complained about the gifts she had promised him and not delivered. This was, one suspects, less a character assessment and more a reflection of Cicero's wounded vanity. But Cicero's hostility captures something real about the Roman reaction to Cleopatra's presence. Rome was not ready for her. Rome was not ready for the idea that the most powerful man in the Roman world might have genuine affection and respect for a foreign queen who spoke her own mind and governed her own country. Cleopatra spent nearly 2 years in Rome, from 46 to 44 BCE. During this time, Caesar was climbing to the heights of his power and toward the crisis that would end his life. He was declared dictator perpetuo, dictator in perpetuity. This was not a temporary emergency appointment in the old Roman sense. This was something new. This was, effectively, a monarchy in all but name. And there were men in Rome, senators, former allies, wounded aristocrats, who believed they were watching the end of the Roman Republic. They were probably right, and they decided to stop it. On March 15th, 44 BCE, the Ides of March, Julius Caesar was assassinated in the theatre of Pompey, stabbed 23 times by a group of senators who called themselves liberatores. He died at the base of a statue of Pompey. Cleopatra was in Rome when it happened. She was in her late 20s, and the man who had been the guarantor of her power, the father of her son, the greatest military force in the world, was dead on a marble floor. She left Rome almost immediately. There was nothing for her there now. The political situation was violently unstable. Caesar's death had not brought back the Republic. It had instead unleashed a new round of civil wars even more chaotic than the last. Caesar's lieutenant Mark Antony and Caesar's great-nephew and adopted heir Octavian were already maneuvering for position, and the conflict between them would eventually engulf the entire Roman world. Cleopatra sailed back to Alexandria. She had a kingdom to run, and she had a son to protect. For the next few years, Cleopatra ruled Egypt alone. These years, from Caesar's death in 44 BCE until her alliance with Mark Antony solidified around 41 BCE, are among the least documented periods of her reign. The ancient sources, so interested in her relationships with powerful Roman men, tend to skip over the times when she was simply governing her own country. But those years were not empty. The world was in chaos. The Roman civil wars ground on with horrifying violence. Vast armies destroyed each other across the landscape of Greece, Asia Minor, Africa, and eventually Egypt's borders. Former allies became enemies. Former enemies became temporary allies of convenience. The political map of the ancient Mediterranean was redrawn almost monthly. In this environment, Cleopatra had to be extraordinarily careful. She was the ruler of the richest country in the world, and every faction in the Roman civil war wanted Egyptian grain, Egyptian gold, and Egyptian ships. She tried to navigate this impossible situation with the same combination of intelligence and caution that had always characterized her best political decisions. When Roman naval fleets appeared off the Egyptian coast demanding supplies, she gave some and withheld others, calibrating her responses to her reading of who was winning and who was losing. She was dealing, during this period, with another family crisis as well. Arsinoe, her younger sister, who had been paraded as a prisoner through Rome in Caesar's triumph, had been released and was living at the Temple of Artemis in Ephesus, an ancient city on the coast of modern Turkey. There, Arsinoe was being hailed by some as the legitimate queen of Egypt. This was a direct threat. As long as Arsinoe lived, there was a rival Ptolemaic claimant to the throne. Any powerful Roman who wished to replace Cleopatra with a more compliant ruler had a ready-made alternative sitting in a temple in Ephesus. Cleopatra watched Arsinoe. She monitored her sister's correspondence. She noted which Romans were visiting and what they were saying. She waited, and she ruled. The administration of Egypt during this period was complex and demanding. The economy had to be managed. The grain harvest, the tax collection, the enormous bureaucracy of the Ptolemaic state that stretched from Alexandria down the length of the Nile to the border with Nubia. She dealt with floods and droughts and famines. With religious politics, the priests of the great Egyptian temples were enormously powerful, and maintaining good relations with them was essential to political stability. With trade, the merchants and traders of Alexandria, whose commercial network stretched from India to Spain. She issued coins, she built temples, she managed the legal system, she corresponded with foreign rulers, she raised her son. Caesarion grew up in the palace in Alexandria, surrounded by tutors and guards and the entire magnificent apparatus of the Ptolemaic court. His mother was preparing him for something, though what exactly depended on a future that was still being written. In the meantime, in Rome, the civil war was grinding toward a conclusion. At the Battle of Philippi in October 42 BCE, the forces of Mark Antony and Octavian defeated and killed the last of Caesar's assassins, Brutus and Cassius, the men who had planned and led the Ides of March. The Republic was dead in all but name. What remained was the question of who would rule what was left. Mark Antony and Octavian divided the Roman world between them. Octavian took the west, Italy, Spain, Gaul. Antony took the east, Greece, Asia Minor, Syria, and the east included Egypt. Cleopatra was now, effectively, in Mark Antony's sphere. The two most powerful people in the Eastern Mediterranean world were about to meet. Mark Antony summoned Cleopatra. He sent a messenger to Alexandria, requiring the Queen of Egypt to appear before him at Tarsus, a city in southern Turkey on the coast, to answer questions about her behavior during the civil war. Had she supported the wrong side? Had Egyptian resources aided the assassins of Julius Caesar? This was political posturing. Antony needed Egyptian grain and Egyptian gold, and this was his way of opening the negotiation from a position of strength. Cleopatra understood this perfectly. She took her time responding. She kept Antony waiting, first at Tarsus and then at various other locations, while she prepared. And when she finally came, she came in a manner so extraordinary that Plutarch, the Greek historian writing more than a century later, described it in prose that still makes the jaw drop. She came by ship, but not just any ship. Her barge was enormous, with a stern of gold and sails of purple. The oars were silver. They beat time to the music of flutes and pipes and lutes. The ship itself was perfumed. the scents of incense and exotic oils carrying across the water toward the shore, reaching people on the docks before the ship was even visible. On the deck beneath a golden canopy sat Cleopatra, dressed as Aphrodite, the goddess of love. On either side stood beautiful young boys dressed as cupids, fanning her with fans. Her attendants were dressed as sea nymphs and graces. The entire city of Tarsus apparently emptied onto the waterfront to watch. Mark Antony was sitting on his formal judgment seat in the town square, waiting to receive her. He found himself alone. The entire population of Tarsus, slaves, freedmen, merchants, soldiers, citizens, had abandoned the square and run to the river to see the Queen's arrival. There is something almost comic about this image. The most powerful Roman general east of Italy, sitting by himself on his ceremonial chair, surrounded by empty space, because the woman he had summoned to appear before him had managed to upstage him so completely that even his own audience had left. The message was unmistakable. He had summoned her. She had arrived as a goddess. He had invited her to dine with him. She sent word that he should come to her instead, and he did. Mark Antony was, in many ways, the opposite of Julius Caesar. Caesar was cool, calculating, precise. He deployed charm as a tool, but kept his inner life guarded. Antony was warm, impulsive, physically magnificent, and possessed of a generosity so large it sometimes crossed the border into recklessness. He was the kind of man who inspired fierce loyalty in his soldiers because he seemed to actually feel things the way they did. The cold, the heat, the hunger, the fear, the joy of victory. He also drank with magnificent enthusiasm and had a long history of complicated relationships with women. He was, in short, a man who was very easily captivated. Cleopatra had done her research. The dinner she gave him aboard her ship that first night in Tarsus was legendary. The food, the wine, the light of thousands of candles reflected in the water, the music, the conversation, and the conversation. This is crucial. Mark Antony was not a stupid man. He was actually quite educated, quite literate, genuinely interested in Greek philosophy and culture. He was in many ways more comfortable in the Greek-speaking East than in Rome itself. Cleopatra met him there. On that intellectual terrain, she spoke to him in Greek, his own preferred language. She discussed philosophy and history and military strategy. She was funny. Ancient sources describe her wit as devastating, her humor as one of her most powerful tools. She made him laugh. She made him think. She made him feel, in the company of a woman who was his intellectual equal and possibly his superior, the rarest sensation available to very powerful men. Understood. What followed the meeting at Tarsus has become one of the great love stories, or great political alliances, depending on how you choose to read it, of the ancient world. Antony returned to Alexandria with Cleopatra. He spent the winter of 4140 BCE in Alexandria, and by all accounts it was a winter of extraordinary pleasure and extravagance. Cleopatra and Antony formed a kind of exclusive society. They called themselves the inimitable livers, the Greek phrase suggesting people who lived in a way that no one else could match or replicate. They held magnificent banquets. They held philosophical debates. They went in disguise through the streets of Alexandria at night, knocking on doors, playing pranks on the citizens, behaving with a freedom that neither of them could access in the formal world of their public roles. There is something touching about this. Two of the most powerful people in the world sneaking through the back streets of a city at night, playing dress-up. They also hunted. They fished. They competed with each other in sports and games with a competitive intensity that the ancient sources describe with some amusement. And they talked. They must have talked endlessly. Two extraordinary minds, with the entire ancient Mediterranean as their shared subject, with armies and navies and cities at their disposal, planning and imagining and building a vision of what the world could be. But spring always comes, and with it, reality. Antony had to return to Rome. His wife Fulvia and his brother Lucius had launched a military campaign against Octavian in his absence, an action that Antony had not ordered and did not want, but which now threatened the fragile peace between the two most powerful men in Rome. He went back to Rome. He negotiated. He managed the crisis. And then, in what was essentially a peace offering, he married Octavian's sister. Her name was Octavia. She was, by all accounts, a woman of genuine grace and dignity, who navigated an impossible position, married to a man who was in love with a foreign queen, as the sister of that man's greatest rival, with remarkable composure. Cleopatra was in Alexandria, pregnant with twins. She gave birth to a son and a daughter, Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, named for the sun and the moon. She heard the news of Antony's marriage to Octavia, and she governed Egypt. 4 years passed. 4 years in which Cleopatra ruled Egypt, raised her children, managed the complex diplomatic machinery of a kingdom surrounded by Roman power on all sides, and waited. She was not idle. She was never idle. But she understood that the situation was still developing, that the Roman world was still unsettled, and that the moment would come. It came in 37 BCE. Antony needed to launch a military campaign against Parthia, the great empire to the east, which had humiliated Rome in 53 BCE with the catastrophic defeat of Crassus at the Battle of Carrhae. Avenging this defeat and securing Rome's eastern frontier was a military and political priority, and he needed resources, money, supplies, ships, the kind of logistical support that could come from only one place. He met Cleopatra at Antioch. He needed Egypt. She knew it. He knew it, and she negotiated accordingly. In exchange for the resources he needed, Antony restored to Cleopatra vast territories that had once been part of the Ptolemaic Empire: Cyprus, coastal regions of Cilicia, parts of Phoenicia, the eastern coast of the Sinai, parts of Judea. He gave her back her ancestors' kingdom, or a version of it. He also publicly acknowledged his children with her, the twins Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, and later their third child, Ptolemy Philadelphus. And Cleopatra became, in every meaningful sense, Antony's wife. The Roman marriage to Octavia was never formally dissolved. This would have been politically catastrophic, but Antony's allegiance in practice was to Cleopatra and Alexandria. They began to construct a grand vision. It is called by historians the Donations of Alexandria, a formal ceremony held in 34 BCE, in which Antony and Cleopatra sat on golden thrones in the Grand Gymnasium of Alexandria, surrounded by crowds of Alexandrian citizens, and announced the shape of a new world. Cleopatra was declared Queen of Kings. Caesarion, her son by Julius Caesar, was declared King of Kings. Antony's children with Cleopatra were assigned kingdoms. Alexander Helios would rule the east, from Armenia to Parthia. Cleopatra Selene would rule Cyrenaica and Libya. Ptolemy Philadelphus would rule Syria and Cilicia. It was an audacious proclamation, a vision of a new power structure for the Eastern Mediterranean, centered not on Rome, not on any single city or man, but on the joint dynasty of Antony and Cleopatra. Rome and Egypt fused into something new. In Rome, Octavian watched this ceremony and understood exactly what it meant, and he used it brilliantly. Octavian was, like Cleopatra, one of the most extraordinary political minds of the ancient world. He was not a great soldier in the way that Caesar or Antony were great soldiers, but he was a propagandist of genius, a reader of public opinion of uncanny skill, and a patient, implacable strategist. He began the destruction of Antony and Cleopatra in the court of Roman public opinion. He spread stories. He made accusations. He read from a supposed copy of Antony's will, which he claimed to have obtained by breaking open Antony's sealed deposit in the temple of the Vestal Virgins, and declared that Antony intended to be buried in Alexandria with Cleopatra and to give Roman territory to foreign children. This was devastating propaganda. Romans could accept many things, but the idea that Antony intended to move the capital of the Roman world to Alexandria to effectively hand Rome to a foreign queen, this struck at something deep in the Roman psyche. The fear of Cleopatra in Rome was real and had been building for years. She was powerful, foreign, female, and unpredictable. Everything that Roman masculine identity most feared. The Romans had a word for what they thought she represented: luxuria, luxury, softness, oriental decadence, the corrosive pleasure that weakened men and empires alike. Octavian did not declare war on Antony. He declared war on Cleopatra. This was a masterstroke. By framing the conflict as a war against a foreign queen rather than a Roman civil war, Octavian could call on the full patriotic machinery of Roman identity. This was not Romans killing Romans. It was Rome defending itself against Egyptian enchantment. In 31 BCE, the two sides, Octavian's forces on one side, Antony and Cleopatra's combined forces on the other, converged on a fateful location, a small cape on the western coast of Greece, Actium, September 2, 31 BCE. The morning light comes slowly over the Ionian Sea. The water is calm. The sky is the deep, achingly blue sky of the Greek autumn. On the southern side of the strait that leads out from the Gulf of Ambracia, the combined naval forces of Antony and Cleopatra are anchored. More than 200 warships, massive quinqueremes and triremes, heavy with soldiers and armoured with bronze. On the northern side, the fleet of Octavian's Admiral Agrippa, one of the greatest military minds of the age, is already in position. The armies are waiting on land, but this battle, everyone knows, will be decided on the water. Antony and Cleopatra's campaign has not gone well in the preceding months. Disease has swept through the army. Desertions have been frequent. Roman commanders and kings who had pledged their loyalty have been slipping away, calculating that Octavian is the rising power and Antony the setting one. Antony's attempted peace negotiations have been humiliatingly rejected. The mood in the joint camp is dark. There is a debate, historians have argued about this for centuries, about what Antony and Cleopatra actually intended at Actium. Did they intend to fight and win? Or did Cleopatra, at least, already have a plan to escape with the fleet and the treasury if the battle turned? The answer to this question changes how we interpret everything that follows. The battle began in the early afternoon, the wind picking up from the south as it typically does on that coastline in the late summer. At some point, and this is the pivotal moment, Cleopatra's squadron broke from the battle line and sailed south, out through the strait, away from the fighting, toward Egypt, taking with them the treasury, the gold, the war chest. Antony, seeing Cleopatra's fleet leaving, followed. He abandoned his men. He abandoned the battle. He left his fleet to fight and eventually to surrender, left his army on the shore to negotiate its own terms with Octavian, and sailed after Cleopatra. This moment, this single, irreversible moment, is the hinge on which everything turns. The ancient sources, almost all of them Roman and therefore hostile to Antony and Cleopatra, interpreted this as Antony running after a woman, choosing love over duty, choosing Egypt over Rome. It made a perfect moral tale. But the reality may have been more strategic than it appeared. Cleopatra may have understood, before the battle even began, that victory was not achievable. The fleet was in poor condition. The army was demoralized and diminished by disease and desertion. Fighting Agrippa at full strength, in a positional battle that favored his skills, was not winnable. The treasury, Egypt's gold, was the most valuable thing in the war. Without it, nothing could be rebuilt. No new army could be raised. No new allies could be bought. If you cannot win the battle, save the treasury, and then rebuild. This may have been the calculation. If so, it almost worked. Antony and Cleopatra returned to Alexandria. They knew what was coming. Octavian would follow. He would bring his army and his fleet and the entire legitimizing weight of Roman authority, and he would come to Egypt to finish this. But they had gold. They had the resources of the richest country in the world, and they had time, perhaps. They spent the winter making preparations. Cleopatra had an extraordinary idea. She began moving ships from the Mediterranean fleet overland to the Red Sea, using rollers and enormous labor, to position them for an escape route eastward if necessary. She was thinking about Parthia, about India, about the possibility of building a new power base in the east if Egypt itself fell. She was still thinking, still planning, still refusing to simply surrender, but her allies were melting away. The kings and client rulers of the eastern Mediterranean, who had pledged their support to Antony and Cleopatra, were now sending their congratulations to Octavian instead. Ships in the Red Sea were burned by the Nabateans, Arab allies who had switched sides. The eastern escape route was closed, and Octavian was coming. In the last months before Octavian's arrival, Antony and Cleopatra reportedly lived with a kind of fierce, deliberate joy. They changed the name of their society from the inimitable livers to something darker and more beautiful. They called themselves the Order of Those Who Will Die Together. There is something in this that stops the heart. Two people who had spent years at the absolute pinnacle of human power and ambition, who had commanded armies and navies and the resources of empires, who had been surrounded by all the luxury and pleasure the ancient world could offer, and who now, facing destruction, chose to face it together. They held banquets, they drank wine, they laughed, they waited. In the summer of 30 BCE, Octavian crossed into Egypt, July and August of 30 BCE. Octavian's army advanced on Alexandria from the east. Antony's forces, what remained of them, went out to meet them. And then, in a moment that may be one of the saddest in ancient history, Antony's cavalry and fleet both defected. They simply stopped fighting. They went over to Octavian. Antony had been abandoned by almost everyone. He returned to Alexandria, believing, it seems, that Cleopatra had made some deal with Octavian, had perhaps surrendered to him, had perhaps been responsible for the defection of the forces. He raged, and Cleopatra, perhaps fearing his rage, perhaps already calculating her own next move, sent him a message. She told him she was dead. Why she did this, whether it was a genuine misunderstanding, a desperate attempt to prevent him from harming her, a tactical calculation or simple panic, we do not know. We cannot know. The ancient sources do not agree, and the truth is probably something more complicated than any of them had access to. Antony, hearing that Cleopatra was dead, decided to die as well. He asked his servant, a man named Eros, to kill him. Eros could not do it. Eros killed himself instead. Antony then took his sword and fell on it. He wounded himself severely but did not die immediately. And then he received a second message. Cleopatra was alive. She was in her mausoleum. Dying, he was brought to her. She was barricaded in the mausoleum, which she had built adjacent to the palace complex. A magnificent tomb she had been constructing for her own eventual burial, which was now serving as her fortress. The ancient source Plutarch describes the scene. with an emotion that crosses the centuries. Cleopatra would not open the doors. She was afraid that if she did, Octavian's soldiers would force their way in. She lowered ropes from a window, and she and her two attendants, women named Charmian and Iris, hauled Antony up. Plutarch writes that those who were present said they never saw anything more heartbreaking than this: Cleopatra hauling up the wounded, dying Antony, with every effort of her body, her face distorted with the strain, those below calling out encouragement. Antony died in her arms. Now Cleopatra was alone. Octavian's forces surrounded the mausoleum. He sent an emissary to negotiate with her, and while they were talking through a small opening in the door, another group of soldiers placed ladders against the wall and climbed through the window above. Cleopatra, when she realized what was happening, tried to kill herself with a dagger she had hidden. She was disarmed. She was taken into custody. She was alive. And Octavian, the future Augustus Caesar, the first emperor of Rome, came to meet her. This meeting between Octavian and Cleopatra is one of the most fascinating and psychologically dense moments in all of ancient history. On one side, a 23-year-old Roman politician and general who was, despite his cold brilliance, somewhat physically unimpressive. He was slight. He was often sick. He did not have the physical magnetism of Caesar or Antony. On the other side, Cleopatra VII, the last Ptolemaic queen of Egypt, 39 years old, who had just watched the man she loved die in her arms, who was a prisoner in her own palace, who had spent her entire life in the service of the survival and prosperity of her kingdom and her dynasty. Ancient sources tell us she was dishevelled, grief-stricken, marked by the violence of recent events, and yet, in their meeting, she appears to have deployed everything she had, one last time. She argued. She presented documents. She tried to distinguish between what was rightfully hers and what was properly Octavian's. She attempted to negotiate. Octavian was polite. He assured her that she would be treated well. He told her not to worry. He was lying. He needed her alive for now, for the triumph he was planning to celebrate in Rome, in which Cleopatra, like Arsinoe before her, would be paraded through the streets as the ultimate symbol of Roman victory over Eastern decadence. Cleopatra knew this. She had been around powerful men her entire life. She knew when she was being managed. She accepted, apparently, the assurances. She calmed down. She became cooperative. Octavian, satisfied, left. And then Cleopatra moved with the deliberateness of someone who has already made a decision from which there is no turning back. On or around August 12th, 30 BCE, Cleopatra bathed and dressed herself in her royal robes. She ate a meal. She wrote a letter to Octavian, asking to be buried beside Antony. She sent the letter, and then she sealed herself in the mausoleum with her two most faithful attendants, Charmian and Iris. When Octavian's soldiers forced their way into the mausoleum shortly after, they found the three women. Iris was dead on the floor. Charmian was falling, dying, barely conscious, still adjusting the diadem on Cleopatra's head. One of the soldiers, it is said, demanded angrily, "Is this right, Charmian?" And Charmian answered, "It is entirely right, and fitting for a queen descended from so many kings." And she died. Cleopatra was already dead. She was lying on her golden couch, dressed in her royal robes, in the posture of a sleeping queen. She was 39 years old. How exactly she died? This question has fascinated historians, scholars, toxicologists, and storytellers for 2,000 years. The snake, the asp, the iconic image of Cleopatra dying from the bite of an Egyptian cobra, hidden in a basket of figs. This is the most famous version of her death. the one that has passed into art and poetry and drama. The cobra was sacred to Egypt. It was the uraeus, the symbol of pharaonic power, worn on the crowns of pharaohs, representing the divine protection of the goddess Wadjet. To die by the cobra's bite was to die as a pharaoh, to die as a goddess. If the cobra story is true, and not all scholars accept it, some suggest she may have used a concealed pin dipped in poison, or even a concentrated mixture of hemlock and opium, then Cleopatra chose her death as carefully as she had chosen everything else in her life. She would not be a prisoner. She would not be paraded through Rome, chained, humiliated, shown to crowds who would mock the name of Egypt. She would not watch her son Caesarion be used as a political pawn or a political threat to be eventually eliminated. She would die as she had lived, on her own terms, as queen, as pharaoh, as goddess. Octavian was reported to be furious. He had been outmaneuvered. He had planned so carefully. He had kept her alive, had her watched, had assured her of his goodwill, and she had still found a way to deny him his triumph. He searched desperately for an antidote. Ancient sources describe physicians known as psiloi, snakebite specialists, attempting to resuscitate her by sucking venom from the wound. It was too late. He was denied the one thing he had most wanted, to parade Cleopatra through the streets of Rome in chains. He had to make do with an effigy, a wax figure of Cleopatra, crafted by his artists, carried through the Roman streets in the triumph, with, of course, a wax asp on her arm. She managed to upstage him even in death. What happened to her children? Caesarion, her son by Julius Caesar, 17 years old and heir to the most dangerous bloodline in the world, was initially allowed to flee. But Octavian's advisors counselled that there could not be two Caesars. Caesarion was hunted down and executed. He was the last of the Ptolemaic dynasty. He was 17 years old. Cleopatra's 3 children by Antony, Alexander Helios, Cleopatra Selene, and Ptolemy Philadelphus were taken to Rome. They were paraded in Octavian's triumph, in golden chains, a girl and 2 boys walking through streets lined with jeering Romans. After the triumph, they were given to Octavia, Antony's Roman wife, Octavian's sister. She raised them. Cleopatra Selene eventually married the king of Mauritania and lived to adulthood, becoming a patron of art and culture. She named her son Ptolemy. She built monuments. She honoured her mother's memory in the ways available to her. The boys disappear from the historical record after Octavian's triumph. They likely died young, their fates absorbed into the silence of history. Egypt became a Roman province. The age of the pharaohs, which had begun nearly 3,000 years earlier in the misty beginnings of recorded history, was over. The last pharaoh was dead on her golden couch in a sealed mausoleum in Alexandria, and the world would never be quite the same. She has been dead for more than 2,000 years. 2,000 years. In that time, the Roman Empire that conquered her rose to its greatest heights and fell. Christianity was born and transformed the world. The Library of Alexandria was lost, her ancestors' greatest monument to human knowledge, gone. Islam arose and reshaped the geography of the Mediterranean. The Renaissance rediscovered the ancient world. Shakespeare wrote a play about her. The Hollywood studios made her into Elizabeth Taylor. Scholars have argued endlessly about who she really was and what she really meant. She has never gone away. Why? Why Cleopatra specifically? Why does this woman, out of all the extraordinary figures of antiquity, why does she remain? Some of it is certainly the drama. Caesar, Antony, the snake, the carpet, the golden barge. But drama alone does not explain 2,000 years of obsession. The truth is more interesting. Cleopatra endures because she embodied something that the ancient world was not prepared for, and that every subsequent era has had to wrestle with in its own way. She was a woman of complete, sovereign intelligence, exercising absolute power on her own behalf, not as a man's wife, not as a man's daughter, not as a man's mother, on her own behalf, as a queen, as a pharaoh, as a person. The Romans found this profoundly disturbing, and Roman writers, the men who wrote the histories that survived and that shaped our image of Cleopatra for centuries, dealt with their discomfort in the way that frightened people have always dealt with powerful women who make them uncomfortable. They reduced her. They turned her into a seductress, a femme fatale, a woman who worked not through intelligence and governance, but through the body, through sexuality, through the dark, irrational arts of love. They wrote her as a threat not just to Antony, not just to Rome, but to the entire Roman idea of masculine rationality triumphing over Eastern passion and weakness. Horace wrote of the Mad Queen. Lucan described her as a scourge. Propertius accused her of being willing to barter Rome for her bedroom. Even Dio Cassius, writing centuries later, described her as using wiles to control first Caesar and then Antony. This is the image that passed into history. A beautiful, treacherous, sexually voracious foreign queen who corrupted great Roman men. And it is, to put it plainly, mostly fiction. Or rather, it is a fiction constructed by the winners. Octavian won. He became Augustus Caesar, the first Roman emperor, and he spent decades carefully constructing the historical narrative that justified his triumph. In that narrative, Antony had to be weak and misled. Cleopatra had to be a temptress. The war had to be a crusade for Roman virtue against Eastern vice. It was brilliant propaganda. It worked for 2,000 years, but it is not history. The historical Cleopatra, to the extent we can recover her beneath the layers of myth and propaganda, is something far more interesting. She was a philosopher queen in the tradition of the great Hellenistic monarchs. She patronized scholars and scientists. She wrote. There are ancient references to works by Cleopatra on subjects including cosmetics and alchemy and gynecology, though these have not survived. She was an administrator of extraordinary capability, who managed one of the most complex economies in the ancient world through decades of crisis, civil wars, famines, economic pressure, political instability, without the catastrophic collapse that her father's reign had threatened. She was a naval strategist who understood the logistical realities of the ancient Mediterranean, as well as any general of her era. She was a diplomat who navigated the most dangerous political environment in the world, the dying Roman Republic and the rising Roman Empire, with intelligence and courage, and ultimately with as much success as the situation could possibly permit. And she was, above all, a woman who loved her kingdom. This is the thing that gets lost in the romance and the drama and the propaganda. Every major decision Cleopatra made, every alliance, every gamble, every relationship, was in service of Egypt, of the Ptolemaic dynasty, of the people along the Nile, from Alexandria to the Nubian border, who depended on stable governance, functioning trade routes, maintained temples, adequate food. Caesar was not just a love affair. He was Egypt's best chance for survival in a Roman-dominated world. Antony was not just a love affair. He was Egypt's second best chance after Caesar died. The donations of Alexandria were not just ego and grandeur. They were an attempt to create a new political structure that would give Egypt genuine autonomy in a world that was rapidly losing any space for autonomous kingdoms. She played every card she had. She played them brilliantly. She played them in service of a cause that was ultimately impossible: the survival of an independent Egypt in the face of Roman imperial expansion. She lost, but she almost won. And even in losing, she denied her conqueror the triumph he most wanted. There is another dimension of Cleopatra's legacy that deserves consideration. She was, and this is rarely emphasized enough, deeply Egyptian, not Greek, not Roman, Egyptian. Yes, she was ethnically Macedonian Greek. Yes, she received a Greek education and moved fluently in the Greek cultural world. But she identified with Egypt in a way that none of her ancestors had. She learned the language. She wore Egyptian dress in temple contexts. She participated in Egyptian religious rituals. The Egyptian priests called her a new Isis, the great mother goddess of Egypt, wife of Osiris, protector of kings. She built temples in the Egyptian style. There is a magnificent temple at Dendera in Upper Egypt, completed during her reign, that still stands today. On its walls, carved in the traditional Egyptian manner, is a relief of a female pharaoh making offerings to the gods. It is generally accepted that this is Cleopatra. She stands there with the double crown of Egypt on her head, performing the eternal rituals of pharaonic religion, carved into the golden limestone in postures that had not changed in 3,000 years. She looks like every pharaoh who came before her. She looks, in those carvings, like she belongs to Egypt, because she did. Let us sit with her for a moment. Not the myth, not the propaganda, not Elizabeth Taylor or Shakespeare's tragic queen. Her, a woman who was born into impossible circumstances, a dynasty in terminal decline, a kingdom being consumed by a rising empire, a family in which betrayal and violence were ordinary instruments of governance, who lost her father young, in emotional, if not physical terms, who watched her sister executed, who was exiled from her own kingdom at 20 years old, with nothing but her intelligence and her nerve, who smuggled herself into a Roman general's quarters in a carpet, who learned 9 languages because she understood, instinctively, that genuine connection was the most powerful political tool available to her, who gave birth to her first child in the middle of a siege, who sat in councils with the greatest military and political minds of the ancient world and held her own, more than held her own, who fell in love, perhaps genuinely, fiercely, vulnerably in love, with men who were also, inescapably, useful to her, and who allowed herself that complexity without apparent shame, who raised 4 children in the middle of one of the most violent and unstable political environments in the ancient world, who kept her kingdom functioning, her people fed, her treasury maintained, through decades of external pressure and internal crisis, who, when everything finally collapsed, chose her own death on her own terms, with her face toward the world and her crown on her head. She was not perfect. She had no compunction about using violence when she judged it necessary. Her brother's death, her sister's eventual fate, were part of the brutal calculus of Ptolemaic rule. She was willing to sacrifice principle for survival when survival required it. She was human, magnificently, completely, devastatingly human. And she lived in a time and place where the stakes of being human, and particularly of being a woman, were inconceivably high. The Nile is still there. It still floods, though now the Aswan High Dam controls the flooding, and the ancient cycle of silt and growth is managed by modern engineering. But the river still moves south to north, still green and brown and gold depending on the season, still flanked by the fields that have fed civilization for 10,000 years. In Upper Egypt, The temple at Dendera still stands. The relief of the female pharaoh on its outer wall, the figure that scholars believe is Cleopatra, still gazes outward across the dry landscape, serene and formal and utterly Egyptian. The limestone is warm in the afternoon sun. The hieroglyphs are still legible for those who can read them. The colours that once painted the walls, deep red and blue and gold, have faded to suggestion, but the suggestion remains. She is there. In Alexandria, archaeologists are still working. Underwater surveys of the harbour have revealed ancient structures, the foundations of what may have been the Royal Palace Quarter, sunken over 2 millennia by earthquakes and rising sea levels. Statues have been raised from the harbour floor. Columns, sphinxes. Somewhere down there, in the dark water and the ancient mud, is the Alexandria of Cleopatra, the Alexandria of Caesar and Antony, the Alexandria of the Great Library, the Alexandria of the Golden Throne and the Floating Palace and the night the carpet was unrolled. It is under the sea now, but it is still there. Everything that was built in passion and intelligence and ambition and love does not simply disappear. It sinks perhaps. It transforms. It becomes sediment. It becomes foundation. It becomes the ground that everything later is built upon. Cleopatra is foundation. She is the ground beneath 2,000 years of story. Every strong woman who has ever been called too much and too clever and too ambitious, there is something of Cleopatra in her story. Every person who has ever refused to be reduced to the version of themselves that other people find comfortable, there is something of Cleopatra in that refusal. Every leader who has ever loved the people they governed, who has ever genuinely, sacrificially tried to protect a civilization against forces that were simply too vast to resist forever. There is something of Cleopatra in that love. She did not win, but she lived so brilliantly, so fully, so without apology, that 2,000 years later, in the quiet of a late night, someone is telling her story and someone else is listening. And that, in the end, is the only immortality that truly counts. So sleep now. Let the story settle around you like river silt. Slow, warm, full of the richness of ancient things. Dream of white marble and blue water. Dream of the smell of incense and the sound of oars beating time. Dream of a young woman unrolling from a carpet in a Roman general's chambers, standing straight, looking him in the eye, and beginning to speak. Dream of a river that has been flowing for 10,000 years and will flow for 10,000 more. Dream of a name that 2,000 years of effort has not been able to erase. Cleopatra, Queen of Egypt, last of the pharaohs, the most remarkable person in the ancient world. Good night.